Tonight, the world doesn't feel normal anymore. It feels like too many warning lights are turning on at once. Not in one country, not in one system, everywhere.
And the most dangerous part? Some of the collapse is physical. Some of it is happening inside the truth people rely on. Fire, flood, pressure, panic, shrinking margins, weakening control. This is what it looks like when crises stop waiting their turn.
The world isn't over, but it is starting to look like the kind of place that could break much faster than people think. So why did scientists move the Doomsday Clock this close in 2026? And what do they see that the rest of the world still refuses to face?
This warning didn't come from panic. It came from rooms where people study how close the world is moving toward irreversible mistakes. And what they saw wasn't one threat. It was several of them, getting closer to each other at the same time. Because the real danger isn't only collapse, it's how little space is left between pressure and failure. One crisis can now feed the next, and once that chain starts, control gets a lot harder to get back. That's what makes this different. The clock wasn't moved for drama. It was moved because the world has become harder to stabilize.
A lot of people think nuclear fear belongs to the past, like it ended with the Cold War and never really came back. But the machines never disappeared. The silos, the systems, the command chains, they were always there, waiting in the dark. And what makes this terrifying now is how fast a modern crisis can move from tension to disaster. Because in a nuclear standoff, sometimes the most dangerous thing isn't an attack, it's a signal misread. One false move, one bad assumption, one leader deciding there isn't time to be wrong, and suddenly the risk is no longer theoretical. It hangs over cities, families, hospitals, power grids, everything people count on to still be there tomorrow. That's why this threat still matters, not because the world wants it, but because one mistake could still be enough. But nuclear danger isn't the only reason the clock moved closer to midnight. Another threat is spreading through the systems people trust every day. Because lies don't have to look sloppy anymore. Now they can look polished, emotional, and real enough to sway millions before the truth even begins to catch up. And once that confusion moves off the screen, it doesn't stay online. It spills into crowds, decisions, fear, and public reaction. At the same time, machines are moving faster than human judgment, and that gap is starting to become dangerous. Because a world that can't agree on what's real becomes easier to provoke, easier to fracture, and much harder to calm down. Then the damage spreads further into markets, emergency systems, transportation, politics, every structure that depends on clear decisions. And when truth gets weaker, while speed gets stronger, the world becomes much easier to push toward disaster. And then there's the planet itself, not as a distant warning, but as a system already slipping out of balance. Heat that overwhelms cities, water that no longer stays where it should, storms that hit harder than the systems built to absorb them. And this goes deeper than weather. It reaches food, land, water, and the basic conditions daily life depends on. That's when climate stops feeling environmental and starts feeling like a threat to civilization itself. Because once the pressure enters homes, hospitals, and human bodies, there is no clean line between nature and crisis anymore. Then it spreads through ports, roads, supply chains, and transportation itself. The systems holding normal life together start bending under the weight. And that's what makes this so dangerous. climate disruption doesn't stay in one category. It feeds other instability wherever it goes. The planet isn't just warming, it's becoming harder to live on, harder to predict, and harder to keep stable. And this is the part people underestimate. The danger isn't just that these threats exist, it's that they're starting to feed into each other, which means the people trying to hold the system together aren't dealing with one emergency at a time anymore. They're dealing with several, all at once. That's how a functioning world starts to feel unstable. Not because everything breaks in a single moment, but because too many things start bending in the same direction. And when that happens, societies don't just become vulnerable, they become tired, tense, reactive, and easier to destabilize. That's what scientists are looking at now. Not one isolated threat, but a world where multiple systems are straining at the same time. A sky that looks wrong, cities under pressure, institutions overloaded, people trying to stay calm inside a world that no longer feels calm. The world is still moving, still lit, still functioning, but the balance holding it together is starting to feel dangerously fragile. 85 seconds sounds symbolic, but that's what makes it dangerous. It turns global instability into something impossible to ignore. Because a number that small means one thing: the margin for error is shrinking. The world is still standing, cities are still lit, systems are still running, but they're doing it under more pressure, with less resilience and less room to absorb another shock. That's why 85 seconds matters. It means this isn't a world with time to waste on denial, delay, or arrogance. It's a world moving closer to the point where one mistake, one bad decision, or one chain reaction could matter far more than before. And if nobody really pulls back, this doesn't stay a warning. It becomes the direction the world is heading. Not one sudden movie-ending collapse, something slower, meaner, and much harder to stop once it starts feeding on itself. A world where people don't live with stability anymore. They live inside adaptation, inside strain, inside permanent uncertainty. And in a world like that, even smaller shocks start hitting harder, because everything is already under too much strain to absorb them well. That may be the most frightening future of all. Not one dramatic ending, but a long slide into a harsher world that keeps getting harder to hold together. And maybe that's the hardest part of all. The world doesn't need to look destroyed to be dangerously unstable. It can still look ordinary. People still wake up, go to work, take care of each other, keep moving. And maybe that's why warnings like this are so easy to ignore. Because as long as life continues, it's tempting to believe stability is still intact. But if the clock is this close, the real question may not be whether the danger is real. It may be whether we'll take it seriously before the next step becomes much harder to reverse.